Hey, welcome back to Rust Order Garage. It is time to get started on the 1956 3100 shop truck project. If you haven't seen the first video, the idea of this truck is to build a fun hot rod for a budget of $5,000 cash outlay. I'm going to show you how I do these low dollar builds. In the end, that's the goal. Can I do it? I don't know. We're gonna certainly try. So that's one of the goals of this build. The other goal is to do this very simply. I'm not going to get crazy with things. I'm going to try to do basic fabrication that any of you could do with a grinder, an exotic tool like a welder, and some measuring. That's about it. Maybe an angle finder. Most of this is going to be pretty basic. And to that point, as an example, rear suspension on this truck. I'm going with a leaf spring rear suspension. I think that is the easiest one to set up. You could do 4-link, you could do truck arm, you could put a Jaguar independent rear suspension in, like out of this parts car, or go crazy and do Corvette. But I'm trying to build this in a way that you could copy what I'm doing. Because the thing is, even though I'm using a 56 Chevy truck, which may not be as easy to get for a budget build, it's a simple ladder frame. Same design used on just about every 1940s, 50s, 60s pickup truck, no matter what manufacturer it is, International, Ford, Chevy, Dodge, whatever. If you can find an old truck and you want to build a cool little shop truck, you can pretty much copy what I'm doing with little changes here and there, but really not much, and do your own budget truck build. So that's the goal. $5,000 in the end out of my pocket, and to build a simple truck that anyone could build. And just, in the end, this is going to be what we want to have, a reliable drive anywhere truck. Because of the budget, there may be some things cosmetically, they're not perfect, but the idea is get the truck done, and then down the road, if you want to change things, you can come back and update those. But the foundation's going to be there. Not going to have to blow the truck apart to make changes. All the major work is going to be the permanent stuff that's going to be there. So also, as I said in the earlier first video introducing this project, I will be using parts cars and wheeling and dealing with parts to make the budget happen in the end. The first thing we're going to deal with is a front suspension, the chassis build. And the front suspension is coming out of this 1984 Jaguar XJ6. And it is a good donor car because these suspensions are fantastic. I rag on Jaguars and say they're junk and make fun of them and such. But reality is these Series 3 Jaguars saved Jaguar. They're actually a very good car. And way over-engineered. And part of the problem was the electrical system and the fuel injection systems were not very good. So that hurts hurts the reliability of the car. But as far as design goes, these things are great donors because the suspensions are heavy duty. So to show how we're doing so far as costs, let's go over some numbers. So just to start off, this is the little list I have here for the Jaguar. This is going to work out good. It looks like it is going to at least break even and possibly put money in our pockets toward the build. So this is an 84 XJ6 that I bought. I paid $500 plus about 50 bucks in gas, probably a little less, but we'll call it $50 in gas to go get it. So in for $550. This car did have a set of knockoff wire wheels on it, which were nice shape. They sold right away. I threw them up for $250, they were gone. So that gets me down to $300 on the cost of this car. It also had a Nardi steering wheel in it that was beautiful, and I sold it cheap at $100, and the guy also needed a injector harness. So $120 for those. Gets me to $180 so far in this car, which means I have $180 invested in the front suspension. But we are nowhere near done yet. I have people on the hook that want to buy some other parts, such as it has a factory power antenna, which is not very easy to find. This car has power door mirrors that all work, a bunch of miscellaneous things somebody wants, and we still have the independent rear suspension here to sell, which I normally sell those at 250, 300, and they sell pretty fast. So I'm not worried about it. So this car in the end is gonna help with the build a whole lot. Things we're gonna keep. Not only am I gonna keep the independent front suspension for this car, we can keep the gas caps, because these Jaguars have 2 of these flip-up gas caps, and they're very cool. And I'm going to put one on this pickup truck, and I will show you, of course, how we do that. So the other thing I'm going to keep out of this car is the shifter. If you check out my little short I put up a couple days ago, these cars have a gated shifter, like a his/hers ratchet shifter, which is very cool. It's in there. It's a T-handle style, and I don't know if you can see the numbers on the shifter there, but it has those lines around the 2 and the drive. And that's a ratchet shifter. If you push on that one way, you can bang it through the gears. And I'll show you that a little later. Almost forgot. Let's go over the numbers for the truck. This is where we are right now. And this is how things work when you do a build like this. So this is a 1956 Chevy half-ton we're building. But as I showed in the original video, we're talking 3 different trucks that are being used to make this. And here's how it all works. The initial 1956 3800 I bought for $2,000 and $50 to go get it. Yeah, that's a cheap price, but that truck, this is why I tell people, don't give up on your project. That truck, somebody started taking it all apart to do something with it, gave up. Parts, trucks, or projects and pieces are not worth much. So I paid $2,050 for that. And you could probably do a lot better where you are, depending on what trucks sell for. But in the end, that's what that thing cost me, $2,050. Now, I'm not going to use the dually chassis. I'm going to keep that for the Mater build. Now, that's got updated one-piece wheels on it, 19.5 tires, an $800 power disc brake conversion kit. It's got a lot of good parts on it. I think it's worth an easy $800 to call it as a value. I think if you wanted to sell that, you get $800 in a minute. So I'm going to call it $800. So I'm going to take $800 off the build because I'm not going to use it. Gets me down to $1,250 invested. Then I had to buy a half-ton chassis. Found one on Marketplace, $450 with gas to go get it. $450, add that in, gets me to $1,700 invested right now. Then we need a bed. I found this 1958 Apache. It's pretty roached, but the bed was the best part of it. And I can still use the cab for the Mater project, and the chassis is good. I paid $550 for that truck. Added in, gets me to $2,250. As I just said, I'm not going to use the 58 chassis. I may put Corvette suspension on it. I may just sell it as it is. I'm not sure yet. But it's easily worth $300. Take it off, gets me to $1,950 invested. I'm going to sell the 58 cab. Well, I'm not going to sell it. I'm going to keep it. But I'm going to call it an easy value toward the Mater build of $250. Take that off, gets me to $1,700. So all in for the truck, the frame, and the bed, I'm at $1,700. We're just talking about the Jaguar independent front suspension. The value of that part is $250. If you didn't have one of these parts cars and you had to get one at a scrapyard, that's usually what I'd pay, $250 for a front suspension taken out of a parts car. Right now, it's costing me $180. That number's going to go down. But add that in, and here you have value, which counts $250. Oh, pressure's on. But I'm really at $1,880. So right now, out of my pocket, for the truck project and a front suspension, I am at $1,880. So that's how this is going to work. There's going to be parts that have a value and then the actual cost out of pocket. That's how I have to do it to make it a low buck build. That front suspension, we're at $180 right now. I guarantee as time goes on throughout this build, that's going to go to zero, and the car will actually make money to offset the cost of the car. But that will happen. First thing I'm going to do is get this front suspension out of the car. All right, we're going to start under the hood of the Jaguar. Now I've moved the distributor out of the engine to make it a little easier to see what I'm doing here, but that's not needed. That's just mostly just to get some space here so you can see. First thing I'm going to do is disconnect the power steering lines. We have a return line here, just held with a hose clamp, and then we have the hard line here that threads into the back of the pump. This is just a sag and aw steering pump. Get some light down here. You can see the nut on the back of the power steering pump. Same as used on bazillion GMs. You may or may not want to keep it for a project. I'm not going to need it for this project anyway, but I'm not going to cut those lines, mostly because, believe it or not, that pressure line that threads into the back of the pump also fits the LS truck power steering pump. So I can use that pressure hose on the conversion to the Jag front, and I don't even have to buy any power steering lines. Same thing with the turn. It's just a hose. I can cut that shorter. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. Get a screwdriver, take the return off, and should be a 5/8 inch wrench, and unscrew that power steering line from the back of the pump. All right, so I got a drain pan under the car. Just take the worm gear clamp off the return line here for the power steering. There are worm gear clamps all over these engines, lots of them, and they're good ones. So this is a major source of clamps. I take tons of clamps off these engines. They're everywhere, especially the long ones you use on fuel lines and such, and these are good ones. All the hardware on these Jaguars is top quality stuff. Most of the hardware you'll find is, there's a lot of grade 8 on here, but there's no junk. So any kind of nuts, bolts, things you want to snag off these parts cars that'll help you in the future for anything, these are good sources for that stuff. All right, so the clamp is off. See if I can get in here with a screwdriver and get the hose off. And then we'll go to the pressure side. All right, ended up cutting the return with a knife just to make it easier. That's draining down into the drain pan. Fluid looks good, which is good. Now I got a 5/8 wrench, and we'll take off the pressure side. All right, pressure hose is disconnected from the power steering pump. We got one more thing to do up on top. The engine is actually bolted to the front suspension cradle, so I have to undo the motor mounts. There's two 3/8 studs with 9/16 nuts that we're going to take the nuts off, one on each side. That's all there is. Okay, I'll take you in for a deep dive on the passenger side. Driver's side will be the same idea, but we're going to go down in here. Let's see if I can show you where the motor mount is. Where are we? There it is, right there. I will put an arrow to that if I can figure out how to do it on the video. But basically, you see that that rubber piece there with the lines on it. It has a stud that goes right up into the engine block to that bracket. And there is a 9/16 nut in there. And we're going to get that off. There's a good look at the driver's side motor mount. That's the one nut we have to get off there. And I had to take the passenger side off just using the open end side of the wrench. I couldn't get the box end around the nut. This side looks like I might be able to. Depends on clearance, but they come right out. So we'll get that out, and that'll be it for the motor mounts. All right, so power steering, pressure line, and return line are disconnected from the pump. Both motor mounts are unbolted. Time to fly the car in the air. Okay, with the car in the air, before I start going over all the mounting points on this thing, got to remove these fog lights. These are Bosch halogens. They work. I can sell those. Horns under the car. They may sound a little funny to be on an American car, but we'll test them, save them. It's a free part for your build. Because in the end, I know this car will be at $0 at least. And I'm going to remove those, remove the fogs. I'm going to remove this little splash shield under here so we can see what we're looking at. And we'll go from there. Okay, fog lights are off, the horns are off. We may or may not use those. I'll probably use the horn from the Silverado donor that's going to give up the engine. But let's go over removal points for this front suspension. As I said before, the Jaguar is a unibody vehicle, you know, just like a second-gen Camaro, first-gen Camaro, Nova, that kind of stuff. So the suspension is a separate subassembly that is removable. It is held in, and these are all the points we're going to get it. There are big bolts in the front, one on each side. These guys here, they hold these outriggers up to the chassis. The sway bar mounts on each side here bolt to the chassis. The shock absorbers bolt to the chassis, but that's going to be the last thing we deal with. We have the brake hoses going through the chassis. We're going to deal with that. The steering shaft. Now, we could have cut this when we were on top of the car, or we can do it after underneath. I'm going to do it underneath. I'm going to remove this cat converter. Part of the exhaust was already off this car. I don't know what they were doing with it, but it was in the trunk. I'm going to remove this to get room, and then it'll be easier to show. But this 3/4 inch steering shaft up here, I'm going to cut that because I'm not going to need this joint. This is a special Z joint, it's called, and that's if you're going to soft mount this front suspension into a hot rod. I'm going to weld it, so I'm not going to need this. The other rear point of attachment is right here. These are the rear mounts for the cradle that go to the frame. So there's not a whole lot holding this in. We're going to leave the shocks for last. And what I'm actually looking at here, these sway bar bolts, I usually just torch them off or hit them with the plasma and cut them because they are tight to get to. But if you don't have a plasma, I'm thinking maybe I just sawzall right through this outrigger because I don't need it, and unbolt it, get it out of the way, and then I can get to these bolts. That may work easier for you guys who don't have a torch or a plasma, because those bolts are just in a tough spot with this outrigger here, and they're in a nut and a bolt. It's not a stud, it's welded or anything, so you have to get a wrench on top and get the nut off. So it is easier to just blow them off with a plasma or torch, but maybe I'll cut these outriggers and try that. I'm going to try that. I've never sawzalled the outriggers off to take out the front end. It's not necessary, but it does make it easier if you don't have a torch or a plasma, like I said. If you're in a country where you're not allowed to weld this in and you have to bolt it in using your factory mounts, then yeah, you can't do this because you need to save these outriggers, and then you'll have to mess with getting those bolts out. But I'm going to get the sawzall and chop right through these outriggers. Easy enough. All right, so I cut through the first outrigger off the cradle there. Notice I do have a jack holding up this because all this work I'm doing, I don't want the suspension to move. If you're doing this on a car trailer or on the ground, you just put a floor jack under it. It's no big deal. So these big bolts here, they just have a nylon lock nut on it. I just got a wrench on it, big adjustable. This is a 1 1/8 socket. I don't think it'll be ridiculously tight to get off. I could be wrong. We may need a cheater bar, because I can't get any leverage. Let's see. There we go. All right. All right, there's the piece of the outrigger we cut off with the bushing. Don't need it. Long bolt, don't need it. Toe bracket, Jaguars may need it. All right, gonna do the same thing on the other side. I'm just gonna cut right through that with the sawzall and remove it. Okay, that actually worked out pretty well, hacking those off. I'm going to end up trimming them back anyway to make them cleaner, but that now gives a straight shot to the sway bar bolt, so that works good. But I didn't even think, you know, I'm used to these Jags. Let me show you some stuff here. We got to evaluate this front end because this is the one we're going to use, right? Just looking at it, which was a surprise, these calipers are obviously recent, which means the brake pads are probably recent, so that's cool. This car has brakes, they work, so the hoses should be good. We'll see if we replace them or not. If they're good, they're good. One thing I do see, the upper ball joints, the boots are torn up, so it looks like we're going to need ball joints, and if we're going to do tops, we're going to do the bottoms. They're cheap, there's no reason not to. Sway bar end links, these are shot, so we'll find something. I may have the bushings in stock for that. They used to sell them cheap on Rock Auto, but I thought the last time I looked I couldn't find them, but they're just standard end link bushings, nothing big. Now the biggest thing about these Jag fronts, or at least the biggest pain, these bushings on the lower here, they don't really wear out. They're always going to have some cracks and stuff on the outside edges, but it doesn't mean anything. When this is apart, grab a hold of the lower control arm and see if you can move it. Generally, they don't wear out. So just because they have some cracks, don't try to replace them. They're cheap, but here's the deal. This lower fulcrum bolt that goes through the frame, through this cross member, and comes out here in the back, and it'll be easier to see when the front end's out. It slides through a tube inside this cradle, and it is a very common, like almost 100%, that at least one of these bolts is going to be seized inside this cradle. I had to make a tool that fits over the end of this, and you can hit it and knock on the bolt and bang on it. I've had them so bad where I had to cut open the bottom of the cradle to heat up the tube to allow the bolt to come out. In the end, not worth it unless those bushings are worn, and they're really not going to be, because most of the time these cars have under 100,000, and even I've had them with 150,000, and those bushings are not worn out. Even though they may not look the best on the outside here, the insides are just fine. So just looking at this front end, we will be doing at least a partial rebuild. The tie rod ends, I think, are recent as well. They're tight, so I'm not going to have to worry about that. And we won't have to worry about the brakes, and the rotors look fine too. They'll clean right up, no problem. So it won't cost a whole lot to replace what we need on this front end, but you know, you check them out and see what you need to replace on it. So anyway, that worked out good. The next thing is going to be to get the sway bar bolts out of here. All right, time to get this sway bar out. I've got a ratchet on top with a 9/16 socket because, like I said, they're not studs, they're nuts and bolts. There's one. Get number two. Well, you know, I think I'm going to cut those outriggers from now on. That's much easier than torching them. That's for sure. Very nice. All right, that's it for the sway bar. Let's move along. Okay, next, we take off the rear mounts. One bolt on each side, 9/16. Can I get to it like this? I can. Don't be scared. It's just, you know, I don't know, 1,000 pounds falling on your head. That's about it. All right, so then we'll come to this side, And we'll do the same thing. Get you over here. We're going to be right here. That's that. Okay, so with the rear cradle mounts disconnected, I'm going to disconnect the steering. It's going to be the easiest way to do it is just unbolt this Z-joint from the rack. I know I talked about cutting the shaft on top. That's usually the way I do it, but I've never used these Z-joints because I always weld in these things, so I don't need it anyway. So it's just as easy to unbolt it here. You just need a 1/2-inch wrench and a 1/2-inch socket and unbolt it here, and then can just pry the joint up off of the rack. The joint is a 3/4 inch 48 spline, so that's the kind of joint we're going to use when it comes time to build the steering. And with the bolt removed, you'll just get that off of there, unless it's really stuck like this one is, because it's never been off. Is that moving like that? That shouldn't move like that. That's something we got to talk about. There we go. All right, steering is disconnected. Now, just notice something we have to talk about. Look how much this steering rack is moving. What that is the bushings in the steering rack. They become oil soaked because these engines leak oil, and makes this rack move around and destroys the handling. So when we get this apart, I'll show it to you, but it's one thing that is an absolute must. If you use a Jaguar front suspension in your build, those bushings have to be removed and replaced with polyurethane. Don't use rubber. Okay, that's out. What's next? Let's see. Okay, just to review, here's everything we've done so far. Disconnected the hoses from the power steering pump. Unbolted each motor mount. Removed both front mounts up in the front. Removed the sway bar attachments. Removed the 2 body mounts in the back of the cradle. And just now we disconnected the steering rack from the steering. Now, I think that's it. At least that's it to get this thing loose. We're going to lower this down. Suspension's going to start coming down, but it's not going to fall out of the car because it's still held in by the shock absorbers. But we do this slowly, just in case something silly happens and something falls. But I'm going to put a pry bar on the back, those 2 mounts that we took the nuts off of, just in case they hang up. I want to watch this thing. It should start coming down evenly. And if it doesn't, sometimes it'll hang up. This looks like it's okay and it's not hanging up. That's below the stud. So I'm gonna lower this down a little bit here. And that is it. This whole front suspension is now loose in the car. All right. So now we got a couple other things to do. I'll get this thing out of here. Okay. One more item to deal with are the brake hoses. Now, you don't want to just cut these. I mean, I guess you could. But on the other side of it is a 10mm nut like this. Okay? You can buy them online, but why buy them if you have them? And inside here, once the suspension's out, there's some other brake lines that use those 10mm nuts, and I cut them all out and keep them all as spares. But what I'm going to do is caveman this. I'm just going to get the cutoff wheel and cut right through the body, chop a section of this inner wheelhouse right out, pull this whole thing out, and cut the brake line. It's caveman, but it works, and you get the parts you need. All right, let's cut this out. got it cut loose. And I couldn't get all the way around it. I usually use a plasma when I do that, but we'll do it on 3 sides. And unfortunately, because I was doing this with the cutoff wheel, I hit my upper bushing there. So depending on how bad that is, we have to replace that bushing. They're easy to replace, not a big deal. Hey, just another expense on a budget build, right? All right, get this out. All right, and there's our brake line. It just broke from me twisting it. So that's the 10mm nut that I need to hook this up to the new build. All right, I'm just gonna hang this out of the way here. I'm gonna move to the other side and cut it the same way. Okay, so both brake lines are cut loose from the body and stuck in with the front end. You could always do some of that from the inside, from the top if you want to in the beginning. I just do it like that. The car is lowered down. It's just, the front wheels are back on. It's just touching the wheels right now. So the weight's on the front suspension a little bit. All that's left is the shocks. That's what's holding this thing in. So, I'm gonna take the shocks out, or unbolt them rather. And that's all it's going to be holding this thing in the car. Now this shock is accessible just like this, no big deal. Driver's side, you have to remove the overflow tank. No big deal, got to get it out of the way. All right, so like I said, for passenger side, it's easy to get the shock out. The stud's right there. Driver's side, it's underneath this expansion tank, which is another neat little item to keep if you ever need one for a swap or something. It's metal, not plastic like the LS in the truck. So a few bolts, we'll get this out of the way. We'll get to the shock. And that's out of the way. And the shock is right there. Probably saw the engine move. Woo! Yeah, okay. Okay. That should be it. Should be able to raise the car and drop the suspension. Go. And there you have it, your very own Jaguar front suspension for your hot rod. You can see all the points of contact that we disconnected because we cut off the outriggers that had the bolts. Sway bar. The rear mounts went here. Brake lines, shocks, disconnect the steering. That's it. That is all. Now, the steering rack, the bushings I was talking about. There's 3 of them. One in there, one on that point, and then one there. You can see there's nothing there. The bushings are gone, destroyed. So that'll get taken apart. We'll put the polyurethane bushings in there and do that while the front end work's getting done. It's going to need ball joints for sure. The steering rack bushings, and that may be it. You know, there may not be anything else. I put a cut in that bushing, so I think that's going to get replaced. But other than that, here's our power steering lines. That's all there is to it. Motor mount studs that we took the nuts off of. Very simple. Needs a good cleaning. This is going to work really well in the truck. So the next I guess the next video, we'll get this cleaned up, get it installed, We'll get the chassis in here and start lining this thing up and figure out where it's going to be. Not going to rebuild it till after all the fabrication work is done. Once the chassis is pretty much assembled like I want it, blow it apart for rebuilding, paint if we're going to do it, any of that kind of stuff. So that was pretty painless, right? And in the background there, you can see the engine just hanging. Yeah, it's wedged on the front. So yeah, it won't fall out, but it's jammed in there. And now I got to get the transmission out of this thing because somebody wants the transmission. So you'll see. Maybe the engine will end up on the floor. We'll see about that. Anyway, I got to finish stripping this thing out to get it scrapped out. I got to get the rear suspension out and all that mess. We'll see you on the next truck video. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Hope this is helpful. This will be a fun build. See ya.